Let's take a look at the SAQs for set number 2. We saw some interesting and complex stimulus and prompts for this set, so let's see if we can make some sense of them. But before we look at this set of SAQs, keep in mind these may not be yours. There are multiple versions of the exam. However, the version that the College Board releases is usually the version that most students received. The first question set features excerpts from two historians commenting on the Revolutionary Era. In Part A, students were asked to describe one major difference between the two historians. The first historian, Gordon Reed, focuses on how white colonists metaphorically compared their condition under British rule to slavery, while ironically, real slavery existed all around them. The other historian, Breen, focused on how democracy and democratic action expanded to more people and socioeconomic classes. For Part B, the prompt asks students to briefly explain how one specific event or development from 1763 to 1800, not mentioned in the excerpts, could be used to support Gordon Reed's interpretation. What I have below are not the only pieces of evidence that could have been used. These are just what first came to my mind. First, I think slavery could be used in a variety of different ways, including discussion of how northern states would implement various emancipation reforms and effectively end slavery in the North. You could also say slavery became further entrenched in the South, and it was a necessary evil. A more specific piece of evidence could be that some slaves were able to find freedom through military conscription in the British or American militaries. And finally, I think a discussion of the natural rights in the Declaration of Independence and how they seemingly did not include enslaved Black Americans, or the same discussion could happen with the Bill of Rights as well. For Part C, students had to do the same thing as B, but this time from the Breen excerpt. Evidence for supporting Breen could possibly be Stamp Act Congress, Sons of Liberty, Continental Congress, possibly other forms of protests and boycotts, maybe things like the Boston Massacre. I think a great development that could easily get the point is a discussion of the increase of representation from different socioeconomic classes in state legislatures as compared to colonial assemblies. Also, explain the protection of democratic liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights, specifically, and constitutional representative state and national government in general. Depending on how you could explain it, I think Thomas Paine's common sense could also be good evidence. Then, some piece of evidence that might work, but I am unsure of, is a discussion of Republican motherhood concept and the events of Shays or Whiskey rebellions. The next question set features a stimulus that is a pamphlet from a women's organization in Mississippi from the early 1900s. And the first question is to describe one purpose of the women's organization in producing the pamphlet. I had to reread this one a few times, but I think the purpose should be something along the lines of it is to convince women and society in general that the traditional roles for women have changed over time. And now, because of the more active role women have in society, they need to actively fight for political rights, specifically suffrage. For Part B, you have to briefly explain one specific event or development from 1840 to 1900 that is not mentioned in the passage and resulted in the ideas such as those expressed in the excerpt. The first things that come to my mind was Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments, and the other being how the 15th Amendment did not include women with the right to vote. There could be some other things, maybe about the temperance movement and women taking a leadership role in that. I'm also sure there could have been other evidence as well. I just can't think of any at this point. For Part C, you have to explain how ideas such as those expressed in the excerpt resulted in one specific effect from 1900 to 1945. The first things that came to my mind were the fight for suffrage led by people like Alice Paul, and then ultimately the passage of the 19th Amendment, and also women working in the war industries during World War I and World War II. For questions 3 and 4, you had a choice between which one you wanted to answer. The majority of my students went with 4, but let's start with 3 first. For 3, there is no stimulus, and it directly asks you to briefly describe one way in which religion influenced European migration to the Americas from 1500 to 1700. Some of the specific influences I thought of were Europeans escaping religious conflict like the 30 Years' War, or to spread the faith, especially Spanish Catholic missionaries, or trying to establish utopian societies like the Puritans. And finally, the last thing I thought of is the New World being a safe haven for folks like the Quakers in Pennsylvania or Catholics in Maryland. Part B asks students to explain one similarity in how religion influenced the development of two colonies in North America from 1600 to 1700. A few things I thought of were Spanish and French colonies had Catholic missionaries focused on conversion of Native Americans, also the mandatory church attendance in the British colonies, and as a focal point of cultural separation between Native Americans and Europeans. Part C asks students to briefly explain one difference in how religion influenced the development of two colonies in North America from 1600 to 1700. For this one, I think evidence around how Spanish Catholics were more ardent in conversion of Native Americans, more so than British Protestants, and that would work well. as well as the strictness of the observation of religious customs and how religion shaped the society of Puritan Massachusetts, in contrast to the less strict Virginia colony. Also, a few other things that could work were contrasting Quaker Pennsylvania, Catholic Maryland, or the more tolerant Rhode Island with other colonies. Finally, we have the fourth question set, which has really two distinct aspects to it, as Part A asks for evidence from 1890 to 1945, and Parts B and C focus on 1945 to 2000. They also ask the writer to do different tasks, from describing to comparing and contrasting. So for Part A, it says to briefly describe one way in which economic development influenced migration within the United States from 1890 to 1945. The first things that came to my mind was how industrialization in the North and the war industries was a pull factor for Black Americans in the South in what we call the Great Migration. You could also discuss Black Americans looking for an escape out of debt servitude of the sharecropping system. The other distinct economic migration I thought of was the Great Depression and Dust Bowl, leading to many farmers escaping the Great Plains for agricultural work in California. Then 4B of the SAQ switches gears a bit and asks to briefly explain one similarity in how economic development influenced two regions of the United States from 1945 to 2000. This one might be a little tricky as it depends on what a person considers a region, and then finding how a similar influence from economic development impacted two different ones. I will be interested in reading the notes that come out of the AP reading about how this one was scored. But I first thought about how both suburbs and the Sun Belt experienced rapid growth fed by transportation networks and the growth of the automobile industry, and how globalization and the loss of manufacturing jobs to foreign countries like China and Mexico affected all the regions. For 4C, it asks to explain one difference in how economic development influenced two regions in the United States from 1945 to 2000. The clearest response I thought of was the rise of the Sun Belt because of air conditioning, aerospace industry, and companies moving from unionized to non unionized areas of the country, and how it had a positive impact on the development of the southern states. However, it had a negative impact on the development of the Northeast and Great Lakes region, which became known as the Rust Belt, and also how the interstate highway system led to the growth of suburbs, but also the gutting of urban centers. Okay, I am sure I do not have all the possible evidence for the responses to these SAQs. If you have some other suggestions and questions about what you put down, feel free to write them in the comments section below. I hope this information helps you out.